Welcome to the next session or panel in our 50 plus Shades of Gothic conference series. This one is one of the panels on Gothic and bodies, more specifically or more particularly on motherhood and domestic gender relations. And we'll have 3 presentations here today. I'll introduce the speakers, then they will have their presentation, then the next speaker, and so on. Okay, so our first in line is Barbara Miceli, who holds a PhD in Euro-American Studies from Roma Tre University in Italy, of course. She is currently an assistant professor in American Studies at the University of Gdański in Poland, and her main research interest is in the relationship between fact and fiction in contemporary American literature and TV series. And her presentation today is titled Pathological Narcissism in a Gothic Setting, Joyce Carol Oates's Evil Eye. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, so I'll start by sharing my screen, hoping that it works as it did before. The focus of my contribution will be on 3 elements. So pathological narcissism, Gothicism, and Joyce Carol Oates, who has been labeled a long time ago a Gothic writer for the violent content of her writing. But her response to this remark was reported in Time magazine, and it read, and I'm quoting, "Gothicism, whatever it is not a literary tradition so much as a fairly realistic assessment of modern life," unquote. This statement embodies the author's relation with reality and shows how her label of Gothic describes in a certain way only some stylistic features of her work and not its content. As she claimed, indeed, the violence she perfuses on her pages is not a Gothic element, but simply, as she said, the horror invading everyday life. Nonetheless, the novella Evil Eye, published in 2013, is an example of Gothic work that sheds light on pathological narcissism, a problem that is often ignored, misinterpreted, and underrated. This problem is also the cause of many episodes of domestic violence, and even though it is mainly known as an annoying but harmless tendency to love and worship oneself, it can actually have more dangerous outcomes than this. Because narcissists are prone to lying, manipulating, deceiving, causing moral and physical violence, with the obvious result of destroying the lives of their closest ones, especially their romantic partners and spouses. So the aim of my contribution today is to analyze Oates's novella to show how Gothic style and conventions can be functional to describe the realistic assessment of modern life, and perhaps to help victims of narcissistic abuse to recognize it and save themselves. So the novella opens with the mention of an object which had belonged to his first wife. The his of this sentence is Austin Moore, a middle-aged man married to Mariana, a woman who is half his age, and his 4th wife. Oates perhaps gives a reference to the fairy tale of Bluebeard by Charles Perrault when she writes about his collection of wives, all unknown to Mariana. This gives the first hint at what such a character will be all along the narration: an ogre. Someone who does not physically destroys his wives, but someone who does shatter their mental sanity. Moreover, the Gothic, according to Alan Lloyd Smith, is about, and I'm quoting, about the return of the past, of the repressed and denied, the buried secret that subverts and corrodes the present, unquote. The mysterious object, an azar, elicits in Mariana a feeling of curiosity regarding Austin's first wife, which starts the sequence of events that shape the plot of the novella. Austin explains that it is a talisman to ward off the evil eye, and it can be found in countries such as Turkey, Spain, and Greece. The first wife, Ines, is from Spain, and this is certainly a Gothic element that can be traced in the text, along with the presence of the mysterious object. Because the choice of giving the Spanish exotic, let's say, nationality to the first wife is consistent with many Gothic stories set in Spain, the most famous of which is The Monk by Matthew Gregory Lewis, which is considered a pillar of the genre. Mariana's curiosity is not only elicited by the talisman, but also by the house where she lives with Austen. One of the tropes of early Gothic is the setting in ancient stone buildings. Yet, as Alan Lloyd Smith notices, I'm quoting, in time, these tropes became as much metaphorical as actual, so that a simple house, a room or cellar could become a Gothic setting, as the mere use of darkness and bareness could call up the Gothic mood, unquote. That is the case with Austen Moore's house, a monument to arrogance and pride, which is a stone and stucco house with glass walls, but replete with mysterious objects, which produce an unsettling sort of beauty, mirroring somehow Edmund Burke's concept of sublime, widely present in Gothic literature. The center of the plot revolves around the visit that Inés decides to pay to her ex-husband, accompanied by her niece Hortensa. Describing Inés to Mariana, Austen says that, quote, she may look like a prima donna, but she isn't really. If you don't let her intimidate you, she won't, unquote. The woman is a former actress, and Austen describes her with words that fall into the typical description of an emotional manipulator, hence using the mechanism of projection, which occurs when the narcissist takes the negative aspects of his own self and projects them onto others. Moreover, the past marriage of Austen and Inés is haunted by the tragedy of their infant Raoul's death. A typical inexplicable crib death happened when the child was 4 months old. The character of Austen, a distinguished and quasi-public man, possesses all the features of the typical narcissist. Having married a needy young woman might be one of this, especially since after the marriage, the woman had given up her own career to become Mrs. Austen Moore. Moreover, he treats her at times like a convalescent, a typical way to reinforce such a dysfunctional bond. Pathological narcissists indeed seek their victims among weak and dependent people, who become codependents and who can be easily manipulated and forced into a submissive lifestyle that they would not accept if they were stronger. Mariana, as it has already been stated, represents the stereotype of the damsel in distress because she loses both her parents in a few months, and she's later consoled and then married by Austen. Yet, as it turns out, in any relationship with a narcissist, his behavior changes in a few weeks after the wedding. Narcissists are prone to explosive or chronic rage reactions, usually without a comprehensible reason. Such reactions often occur when Mariana dares moving furniture in her husband's house to make it more comfortable, or when she addresses him in an overly familiar way in front of others. The mask that Austen wears in public and at work slides off in the intimacy of private life. The visit that the first wife pays to her former husband and his new wife soon becomes a Gothic scene, since Inés is missing an eye. What Mariana starts wondering is why her husband did not inform her of Inés's problem, which is part of Oates's frequent descriptions of bodily mutilations, which in the story are also a disquieting and unsettling element. Moreover, the spatial imagery of modern female Gothic, according to Ellen Morse, is based on portrayals of physical distortion and disfigurement. The person accompanying Inés in the visit, the niece, Hortensa, is an equally unsettling figure, with small and closed eyes, colorless lips, and coarsened features. The girl seems to possess yet another feature. She is immune to Austen's charm. The dinner the four have together brings up another characteristic element in a relationship with a narcissist. Triangulation, indeed, is a common manipulative tactic used by the narcissist, which consists in using a third party to confuse the codependent. Even if there is nothing between the narcissist and the person used for the triangulation, the codependent starts to feel jealous and or insecure because they are compared somehow to this other person. And the fact that Austen has dressed up and shaved twice in a day makes Mariana think that he might still harbor an interest in his first wife. Moreover, the triangulation is made even stronger by the fact that the man ignores the fourth wife and devotes all his attention to Ines, who, when she remains alone in the room with Mariana, tries to warn her about Austin's personality. Ines explains with precision what a codependent is, though not using this word, and how a narcissist, such as Austin, uses this condition to destroy his women's lives. The picture displayed by the woman is essentially what Mariana herself is experiencing, since a pathological narcissist is unable to change his attitudes and behaviors. Moreover, again in Lloyd Smith's words, and I'm quoting, Gothic characters are often shown as struggling in a web of repetitions caused by their unawareness of their own unconscious drives and motives, unquote. So Austin tends to repeat the same behaviors with each new wife. Although Mariana does not want to listen to the truths Ines is revealing, something in her wants to be seduced, violated, transformed. So the woman goes on describing her former husband in this way, and I'm quoting, "His madness, he can disguise as many men do. So the woman comes to doubt her own sanity," unquote. Even if she does not call this last feature with its name, she's describing the practice of gaslighting, which consists in trying to convince the codependent that something they believe is not true, making them question their own thoughts and mental balance. The practice takes the, takes the name from the 1944 film Gaslight, directed by George Cukor and starring Ingrid Bergman, in which the husband manipulated the gaslighting to drive his wife crazy. Eventually, Ines mentions the death of her child and the destruction that followed, the rejection of Ines from Austin's house and life, which seems to be the typical discard treatment that a narcissist reserves to his victims, since narcissists feel secure and triumphant only when they have destroyed everyone else, and particularly when they have frustrated the efforts of those who love them. It is very likely that the victim, manipulated and mistreated, develops suicidal or murderous thoughts towards the narcissist. That is what happened to Ines, who plotted to poison her husband with a mixture of barbiturates and tranquilizers, making them pass for the usual antibiotics he used to take care of his frequent sinus infections. But after the dinner, what she develops is the opposite urge. Indeed, she tries to kill herself by cutting her wrists, and she gets briskly kicked out of the house by Austin, an obvious symptom of the lack of empathy that characterizes narcissists more than anything. Afterwards, Mariana asks her husband why he had not warned her about the physical disability of his former wife. And Austin's response is both a gaslighting and a devaluation, as he maintains that the young wife had only imagined it. The missing eye becomes even more grotesque in this phase because it is both real and unreal simultaneously. The gaslighting that Austin applies to his wife makes the reader wonder whether this is only a manipulative tactic to bring Mariana to madness or something she really had just imagined seeing. A Gothic atmosphere dominates the house in the following weeks. As if the first wife has cast a spell on the house, Mariana becomes aware of her presence through headaches, indigestion, and insomnia. She also develops a compulsive gesture, that of touching the right eye to check out if it's still there. She decides then to do something that the author leaves voluntarily blurred. Mariana indeed gets hold of a prescription for sleeping pills and buys a large amount of them. The reader is brought to believe that the woman will use them to poison her husband, but this fact remains somehow confusing in the final lines. Anyhow, whether Mariana decides to kill herself with the pills or her husband, as many Ossian characters, she's only acting according to, and I'm quoting from Oates, the forbidden lawless impulse as a given in the human psyche, which frees victims, particularly women, to retaliate against people and situations that threaten, unquote. This gesture is consistent with the Gothic patterns since, as Oates claims, and I'm quoting again, the powerful appeal of the Gothic world is that its inhabitants, who resemble civilized and often attractive men and women, are in reality creatures of primitive instincts, unquote. The leading force in this case is Austin Moore's mental disorder, which drives all the events in the story and also the other characters' behavior and psychological sanity. It is this last aspect that really concerns the author. And Oates' Gothic has a specific function that holds an inextricable connection with reality and its problems, and the documentary purpose of disclosing quotidian narratives of female victimization. Choosing the Gothic genre and this particular setting is not fortuitous, but it is an agenda that is consistent with the fact that, according to Susan Baker, Gothic, and I'm quoting, Gothic horror is domestic horror, family horror, and addresses precisely these obviously gendered problems of everyday life, unquote. Gendered violence, indeed, is quite often what produces news of murders and mistreatment that resemble very much even the scariest and most unsettling Gothic story. As Oates declared in a 1972 interview, and I'm quoting, "It seems that I write about things that are violent and extreme, but it is always against a background of something deep and imperishable. I feel I can wade in blood. I can endure the 10,000 evil visions because there is this absolutely imperishable reality behind it," unquote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, not only for this a neat presentation that showed how Joyce Carol Oates uses an old trope from the Gothic, but also applies it to more modern settings, and as you were saying, to the everyday lives of people, and also, of course, for sticking to the time very well. Always appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's move to our second speaker here today. Muriel Moore has a PhD in English language and literature from Queen's University in Canada. She currently teaches courses on disability representation, culture, and justice at Ryerson University, also in Canada. Her research interests currently include investigation of dead bodies as narratological objects in American hard-boiled detective fiction and the representation of disability justice in the immersive narratives of video games. And today's presentation is titled, quite longishly, "The Monster Feels My Tiny Little Movements Inside, Motherhood and the Boundaries of Space in the Yellow Wallpaper and the Haunting of Hill House." Looking forward to this. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So I crept my way into the conceptual framework of this paper after noticing a unique similarity between Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper and Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which then prompted questions about Darren Aronofsky's 2017 film, Mother. The two texts in the film draw on conflations of space and motherhood that are both compelling and terrifying to their main protagonists. What captured my attention, however, was how motherhood as a role and identity was conceptualized and embodied through these strange and queer spaces. Embodiment implies taking possession of a space, but in these narratives, it also means remapping and reconfiguring the dimensions of Gothic space through unusual but empowering redefinitions of each woman's unique relationship to motherhood. This formulation suggests that space and subject aren't passive entities, but interdependent geometries defined by their interactions and interstices. If agency comes from locating ourselves in relation to the spaces around us, then geometry is the tool we use to measure and quantify that space. Geometry is a branch of mathematics concerned with the properties and relations of points, lines, surfaces, and solids that deduces the angles, figures, and properties of space, and the standard principles of spatial geometry were developed by Greek mathematician Euclid in 4th century BC. Determined by a man and upheld by a long history of male-centered scientific systems, Euclidean geometry may easily be seen to metaphorically correlate with traditional social rules and patterns, those that we accept as normal in terms of gender roles, societal expectations, and conforming principles of behavior. Specifically here, Euclidean geometry may be used to represent the confining patterns that women are expected to abide by, particularly in their position as mothers. Roberta Rubinstein has previously noted that houses and mansions function figuratively as maternal spaces in the female Gothic, and the haunted house of Gothic fiction has long been a fixture of the genre associated with domestic and female imprisonment. This view has been cultivated through various interpretations that fixate on the repressed woman in the home and the stark and rigid patriarchal conceptions about womanhood, motherhood, and femininity. Although published 67 years apart, Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper and Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House were both written in periods characterized by rising waves of feminism and concerns over women's mental health while confined to domestic roles and spaces. Both texts also address internal fears about motherhood, postpartum depression, filial and maternal responsibility, cultural constructions of motherhood as an ideal, and the doubling of mother and daughter. However, the maternal domestic spaces of Hill House and Gilman's Mansion are not easily quantifiable. In fact, they seem to defy and deny easy comprehension and cohesion. Much the same can be said about the female body. Philosopher Quil R. Kukla perhaps states it best, quote, female bodies, and especially pregnant and newly maternal bodies, leak, drip, squirt, expand, contract, crave, divide, sag, dilate, and expel. It is no surprise that historically such bodies have seemed to have dubious, hard to fix permeable boundaries, end quote. The maternal body is the image of the body unbounded and in defiance of the quote, mythical, well-bounded, fully unified, seamless, masculine body, end quote. The female body is not a conventional space, and motherhood prompts many fears and anxieties about how maternal spaces and identities should be inhabited and informed. In the Gothic mode, neither female bodies nor maternal spaces align themselves so easily with Euclidean geometries, just as idealizations and conventional expectations of what it means to embody the identity and role of mother so readily real. Of becoming develops as a transformative and transitional one that engages women in a restructuring of these physical and figurative spaces, both private and public, and how she takes up possession of and in them. So, what if Euclidean geometry gets thrown out the window, just as Gilman's narrator throws the key to the attic room out of her window? Non-Euclidean geometry defies strict lines, points, and patterns, creating numinous and even chaotic spaces that can feel uncanny because they suspend or defeat the fixed laws of nature we rely on to comprehend unplumbed or aberrant spaces. The invocation of non-Euclidean space, space that does not abide by the principles and properties originally laid out by Euclid, is useful in our reinvestigation of the female Gothic, as it elicits an exploration of unmeasured or immeasurable space hidden within the Gothic's feminine spaces. A maternal geometry then prompts a reorganization of the principles and angles by which we measure the properties of feminine space. Viewed this way, Jackson and Gilman offer an opportunity to engage with a rich imaginative framework that reconfigures maternal spaces as spaces that simultaneously exist both inside and outside of dimensional paradigms. Like spectral entities can pass through walls, unbound from time and space, Gothic heroines are not merely navigating spatial constructions, but moving between them, recognizing that inside and outside cleave, simultaneously dividing and clinging in anomalous but formative ways that create new interstitial dimensionalities. Melding into these spaces at first appears to represent a descent into madness, but ultimately leads to innovative forms of maternal possession and agency. It only looks like madness because it is unconventional. The Yellow Wallpaper, then, functions as an allegory for Gilman's own endeavors to move the culture of motherhood and childbearing out of the private sphere and into the public sphere. The narrator engages in a renovation of social norms, facilitated by her navigation of the strange and queer spatial design of the titular wallpaper. As she progressively begins to make sense of this new principle of design, aligning herself with its inherent geometry, She becomes capable of being both inside and outside the paper, as well as between its patterns. And her movement in these interstitial spaces with other creeping women allows for a reconstruction of how motherhood as an ideal is conceived. In her nonfiction writing, Gilman was invested in a collective ideal of social work for women. Motherhood was not the work of one woman trapped in patriarchally defined spaces, but the work of a great many women who had hitherto been stuck behind the silly and conspicuous bar like outer pattern of conventional feminine space. Creeping becomes a way of navigating these interstitial spaces of feminine identity and work. The story thus engages in an argument for a change in how we view motherhood, not as an individual burden full of anxiety and fear, but as a social project that elicits the interdependent strengths of many women, what Gilman in Women in Economics refers to as a wider maternity in both theory and practice. In Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, Eleanor Vance too slips into interstitial spaces as she learns to navigate and even align herself with the absolute reality under which no one can exist sanely, and the tiny aberrations of measurement that characterize Hill House. While readings of the novel usually define Eleanor's confrontation with the mother house, that is Hill House, as representative of her fear and desire to be mothered and to return to the all consuming womb, the application of a maternal geometry to the text suggests that Eleanor actually engages in a reconciliation of her desire for independence and her own maternal instincts, or the desire to mother, as she takes possession of the motherless Hill House, which both wants and needs her. Her encounter with the maternal geometry of the house instills in Eleanor an acknowledgement of the illusionary quality of her desire to escape into mere childishness, where she would remain homeless, as well as an interdependent bond with Hill House, which gives life to her own maternal instincts to protect and nurture. What Jackson offers is not a terrifying cycle in which the daughter must become her mother, subsumed into her, but instead a reconceptualization of what motherhood might look like if perceived as regenerative rather than purely destructive. Eleanor rewrites and even usurps her core image of motherhood as represented by her own cruel and invalid mother, and constructs herself as a mother who is entirely unlike her, playful, imaginative, compassionate. Eleanor's individual relationship with motherhood shifts from a suffocating conception of maternity to one that is multifaceted and reciprocal. It is not surprising that Jackson, who was known for being an eccentric mother, unconventional in her approach to her children, delineates a motherhood that is more multidimensional in Hill House, one that allows Eleanor to firmly grasp the role and responsibilities of motherhood while also maintaining the imaginative qualities of magic and wonder that may be hidden in the interstices of maternal space. Both Hill House and the Mansion of the Yellow Wallpaper at first incite feelings of disorientation and misalignment, with patterns supernaturally disturbed and angles discomfortingly wrong. These are unintelligible spaces to those who enter, but Gilman's narrator and Jackson's Eleanor align themselves with a non-Euclidean maternal geometry that makes these spaces not only accessible, but infinitely empowering. And in this process, the boundary between the house's space and the spatial geometry of female agency becomes blurred, resulting in a collapse between subject and object, inside and outside. Both characters end up defying traditional principles of motherhood, and only by learning to understand the unique geometry needed to navigate this terrifying space do they develop a new relationship with motherhood, one drawn by their own principles and desires. I propose that this motif continues today in Gothic narratives, including films like Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak and prominently Aronofsky's Mother. Although its resolution is significantly darker in tone, Mother engages Jennifer Lawrence's character, a personification of Mother Nature, in an exploration and navigation of the spaces of a house that is revealed to be the embodiment of her, even as Javier Bardem's character, him, or God, rigidly attempts to claim these spaces as his and share them with his invasive followers. While the house is said to be his house, him reveals that Mother is home. He may live there, but she defines, renovates, restores, and controls these spaces that are both inside and outside of her, as suggested by scenes where Mother feels her own heartbeat by pressing her hands and forehead to the walls of the house. This is why all of the acts committed within the house are committed against her, mentally and physically, and this is why only she is capable of destroying and restoring the house, breathing life into every room. It is instead suggested that men and mankind exploit these spaces and rigidly define them using absurd laws and doctrines, defying and ignoring Mother's cries to stop, but also her knowledge of the spaces, both visible and hidden. The film is an allegory for biblical events, tracing a history from Genesis to the Apocalypse, but it is telling that the ending results not in salvation and trumpets blaring on Judgment Day, but rather Mother's refusal to forgive humanity for its sins and horrors perpetuated against her. Arguably, however, Aronofsky misses the point of his own film. While it ultimately centers on him as the creator figure perpetuating the cycle of creation and destruction, unwilling to let Mother go, all the power of actual restoration belongs to her. Still, in participating in this tradition, Mother engages not only in questions about maternal spaces and how they are defined, but also the necessity of subverting and renovating them, even if over and over again until we get it right. Gothic houses need not be a domestic trap, dangerous and imprisoning, but a way of interfacing with new forms of space and self-possession as women reclaim these maternal spaces through unconventional remappings of patterns and figures, creating multidimensional and nuanced spaces. I see Gothic space as potentially transformative space that requires a new formulation of principles, angles, and figures that engage in an innovative understanding and cultural development of what it means to be a woman and a mother, both collectively and individually. And as women learn to navigate and chart these maternal spaces using a new language of meaning and subversion, they remap their own relationship to motherhood, rewriting the traditional feminine ideologies that may otherwise have confined them or driven them mad, inhabiting, informing, and possessing them instead. Thank you.
Thank you for this intriguing talk about the remapping, as you repeatedly said, of female spaces within the domestic sphere and beyond. Great stuff. And also for linking it to more recent examples of the Gothic, such as Mother, as you were saying. I was also thinking, to be honest, about House of Leaves, though in a different context, non-Euclidean spaces, and the black hole essentially becoming maternal in a certain way, but we might go into that later. Thank you. Our third speaker is Carrie Walsh, who earned her master's degree in Gothic studies from St. Mary's University in London. Now she is a PhD student and graduate teaching assistant in the Department of English at Georgia State University, and her work focuses on literary theory, the Gothic, and gender theory. And her presentation today is, of course, also at the intersection between Gothic and gender on the X-Files, Monstrous Birth, Holy Mother. Carrie?
Okay, so,
Great.
All right. So I just want to start by sort of talking a little bit about the X-Files and the fact that I think we can see that the enduring popularity of the X-Files is demonstrated by its resurgence and the reboots that were done in 2016 and 2018. I think it clearly has a significance, not only in television, but in American popular culture in general. But also, I think that in particular, the X-Files' contribution to contemporary notions of the Gothic cannot be understated. And that's where I want to kind of begin my presentation today. So in X-Files, a consistent theme in the Gothic generally is the encounter with the unknown. These unknowable aspects are not only physical, but also epistemological. So while this is also an overarching theme of the X-Files, the search for truth, both material and metaphysical. So while the X-Files says over and over again in their most common tagline, the truth is out there, the truth is also in here. In other words, it's within us, it's in our minds and how we perceive the world. Consequently, the X-Files often features sexual difference as a complicating factor in the search for truth, and this mirrors the Gothic. Ruth Bienstock-Analik in Horrifying Sex mentions that Gothic anxieties regarding sex and sexuality are a manifestation of the fear of the unknown. So while typical Gothic works center on the supernatural, the monstrous, the inhuman, they also tend to locate horror upon the human other, and specifically on the sexual other. Furthermore, the bodily incarnation of difference from the basic human norm is the monster. Therefore, Barbara Creed mentions in Horror and the Monstrous Feminine that the difference of female sexuality is a difference which is grounded then in monstrousness. The procreative abilities of women are viewed as being particularly monstrous and reinforce Gothic notions of the sexual other. So, especially viewed from a male subjectivity, pregnancy is ambiguous, even horrifying. The pregnant subject is decentered, split, or doubled. Pregnancy also challenges the integration of the pregnant woman's body experience by rendering fluid the boundary between what is within herself and what is outside, separate. Woman's maternal monstrousness then links to a power that men do not possess. Theories of conception of monsters, says Rosie Braidotti, are at times extreme versions of the deeply seated anxiety that surrounds the issue of women's maternal power of procreation in a patriarchal society. Thus, pregnant women are the abject. Julia Kristeva asserts that the abject in general is the improper, the unclean, and the filthy. However, the abject also is the in-between, the ambiguous, the composite. It is the place where meaning collapses. In this way, the abject and the Gothic dovetail. Woman is inherently unknown, inherently abject. Kristeva specifies that if someone personifies abjection without assurance of purification, it is a woman, any woman, the woman as a whole. Originally, religion's purpose was to purify the abject, but according to Kristeva, art has now taken religion's place. Barbara Creed posits that purification of the abject can be accomplished by the catharsis of horror films. For Creed, the horror film then is an attempt to shore up the symbolic order by constructing the feminine as an imaginary other, which must be repressed and controlled in order to secure and protect the social order. Thus, the horror film stages and restages a constant repudiation of the maternal figure. The number of depictions of monstrous women, and particularly monstrous pregnancy and birth in the X-Files, points to a preoccupation with the abject maternal figure. The first episode I wish to examine is Eve, which centers on two young female clones with murderous tendencies. A clone is already abject. It is doubled, tripled, yet split. The girls in Eve are clones of clones, so they are doubly abject. Cloning can be seen as an attempt to usurp woman's procreative power. In Eve, though, eventually the cloning is performed by a female clone and produces only other female clones. In other words, reproduction without men. This can be perceived as symbolic castration. Eve also touches on the fear, common particularly in the 17th century, that a, quote, monstrous mother will produce a monstrous child. This notion is heightened by the belief that women are inherently stable. Victorian era doctors argued also that women are more vulnerable to insanity than men. The Eves are all brilliant, but morally ambiguous, violent, prone to suicide, and all are at some time confined to psychiatric hospitals. In Eve, then, the implication is that man's own inherent rationality offsets women's propensity for mental disorder and the possibility that this will be passed on to the child. The female-only clones attempt to further the project without male supervision or input results in the aberrant, murderous preteen girls. Absent a male influence, the clones cannot help but give in to their monstrous instincts. When the twins eventually kill Eve 7, she asks them why. The girls respond, "You tell us, you made us, we're your mistake." Just skip this part, sorry, time constraints. The next episode I wish to look at is Home. Home has been called the most disturbing hour in television history and was banned for 3 years after it first aired in 1996. Home concerns incest and murder, the two taboos that help establish the morality of man, according to Freud. Incest between the mother and child is particularly abject because it blurs boundaries, especially when a child is produced. In part, this is because of genetic abnormalities, which often occur. In the episode, Scully states that the dead infant's cells would have had to, quote, divide triple-fold in cell metaphase in order to produce such severe abnormalities. Later, the agents theorized that generations of inbreeding have led to a weakening of Mrs. Peacock's ovum, allowing all 3 Peacock brothers, 2 of which are also the incestuous product of Mrs. Peacock and her eldest son, to simultaneously father the child. They are therefore doubly or even triply abject. The horrifically deformed dead child then embodies the abject. Certainly for this episode, as Robin Wood states, the monster is the family. This is reinforced by the portrayal of both Mrs. Peacock's maternal body and her love as monstrous. Mrs. Peacock is a quadruple amputee and seems to live on a wheeled board underneath a bed. However, she is not portrayed as the victim. She is the dominant family leader. The sons never speak, in fact, they only grunt. The final scene, after the other sons are killed, shows the eldest son and Mrs. Peacock in the car's trunk as a makeshift womb. She tells him that they will move on, start a new family, a new home. She is indeed a monstrous mother with a monstrous family. For time, I'm skipping over terms of endearment, but I have a lot written about it. Agent Dana Scully is a subversion of these stereotypes, and that's the one thing I think that sort of helps the X-Files be a little less misogynistic than it can sometimes appear. So in contrast to stereotypes, Scully is the rational, level-headed one to the intuitive, emotion-driven Mulder. Scully fits some of the characteristics of Carol Clover's final girl. She is a victim, but she saves herself and Mulder as often as he does her. She has masculine interests, inevitable sexual reluctance. She is apart from other girls, and she has a gender-neutral name, Dana. Above all, though, at the level of the cinematic apparatus, her unfemininity is signaled clearly by her exercise of the active investigating gaze, normally reserved for males and punished in females. So while Scully is monstrous simply by being a woman, she also has an alien implant inserted during her abduction, and she has alien DNA. This could be interpreted as a sign of her difference or her impurity, as Barbara Creed puts it. However, in Scully, it doesn't taint her. It is actually a mark of her strength. Offsetting Scully's rigid adherence to scientific principles is her Roman Catholic faith. Scully still wears a gold cross necklace gifted to her by her mother, and it figures prominently in several episodes. Scully's Catholic roots also figure prominently in her desire for motherhood. Scully is left barren after her abduction and the experiments performed on her. All of her ova are stolen. From one of these, Emily is born. Emily turns out to be a hybrid, but she is also sick, and the secret treatments that she receives from the syndicate are not helping. So finally, Scully gives in and allows her to die. Eventually, Mulder finds some of Scully's unviable ova in storage. She still tries to conceive via IVF, even though these are supposedly unviable. It is unsuccessful. Yet, despite this, at the end of Requiem, Scully announces she is pregnant. William's conception, then, is undoubtedly miraculous, since she has no ova left and IVF failed. Contrasted with Emily, Scully's new unborn child is very special, a perfect human child, important, a miracle, and greater than the aliens men trying to make hybrids. There are three basic theories surrounding the paternity of William. The one only recently came out in the final series finale, which was season 11 in 2018. That the cigarette smoking man basically did an experiment and impregnated her, and therefore is William's father and, quote, creator. The other one is that William was a syndicate experiment to create super soldiers. And the last one is that it was some sort of divine intervention. The show uses somewhat cliched imagery and allusions to portray Scully's pregnancy as divine. When Scully gives birth, the super soldiers there to retrieve her child mysteriously leave without touching him. Mulder finds her without exact coordinates. She gives birth in an out-of-the-way area, and the lone gunmen as Ursat's wise men bring her gifts. Instead of a virgin birth, though, William's conception is strongly implied as being the result of the sexual union of Mulder and Scully, with a little help. This is demonstrated in the scene from Existence, which I'm going to play now, if it'll work.
They came to take him from us. Why they didn't?
I don't quite understand that either. Except that maybe he isn't what they thought he was. That doesn't make him any less a miracle, does it?
From the moment I became pregnant, I feared the truth about how and why. And I know you feared it too.
I think what we feared were the possibilities. The truth we both know.
Which is what?
So William is a divine child, but he's also a monstrous child. He has telekinetic powers, he can interact with alien artifacts, and he has alien DNA. Ultimately, William, though, must be sacrificed. So Scully gives him up for adoption to protect him. I think there's a possibility that we can see William as being part alien and the biological child of Mulder and Scully, miraculously conceived in sexual union. In a final word, I just want to talk a little bit about what I think this all means. And Barbara Creed, again, posits that the horror film stages and restages a constant repudiation of the maternal figure, but Scully is shown as beyond reproach despite her monstrousness. Robin Wood states that the other must be dealt with either by rejecting and, if possible, annihilating it, or by rendering it safe and assimilating it, converting it as far as possible into a replica of itself. But while Scully is shown as embodying the idealized notion of motherhood, especially with Mulder in that scene you just saw, because of her masculine coding and Williams' DNA, it is subversive motherhood, a monstrous yet idealized mother and child. Julie Meese asserts that conventionally female monsters are more than anything male fantasies, expressing male anxiety regarding powerful women. But this can be opposed by recovering and celebrating the figure of the female monster, creating the female monster hero. She explains that the monster that is positively female interrogates and destabilizes the norm that dictates that the female be passive and virtuous, and also disrupts the concept that the female other is essentially different and therefore unknowable and to be objected. Scully is monstrous, but she isn't marginalized. Her subjectivity is integral to the show. Her monstrousness is not portrayed as negative, nor is she separated or rejected because of it. In fact, Scully is actually elevated by her monstrous qualities. By saturating Scully's pregnancy and the birth of William with religious themes, Scully is allowed to retain her monstrousness while still becoming sacred, almost holy. She is powerful, possibly even immortal, and her character arc allows her to subvert and transcend the tropes of maternal monstrousness, which the X-Files demonstrates so heavily. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry, for returning in a certain way, as you also stressed in the beginning, to one of the most iconic series of the 90s, not only, but also a series that very much influenced, as you were saying, Gothic aesthetics since, that has influenced Gothic aesthetics since. Okay, that means we're at the conclusion of our talks. As a reminder, for those of you, the non-presenting audience, if you'd like to join the discussion, feel free to use the reaction button provided by Zoom. If you turn on your cameras, you will be included in the video that will be uploaded to YouTube. So if you turn on your camera, you consent to that. Okay, Monica already has her hand up.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, thank you very much for this panel. Thank you very much for presentations and for coordinating, Michael. I really liked how well connected the presentations were dealing with anxieties about the female subjects and femininity. I've got a question for Barbara. It's quite specific, but maybe we can discuss about topic after more broad terms if someone wants to. I was wondering about when you said that the first wife of the protagonist is from Spain, and you mentioned Matthew Lewis's The Monk, but when you were going to say that, in my head I was like, well, there's another kind of pioneering work in the Gothic set in Spain, in this case in the American tradition, which is the Alhambra Tales by Washington Irving. So it got me thinking, why this so often? And I was thinking about maybe about religion. Is it about Catholic order? Because I know in the Southern Gothic tradition, Catholicism is quite present in Flannery O'Connor, at least. But I don't know about Joyce Carol Oates or any. So what's the role of Catholicism in the United States? Is something I'm not familiar with, but I just your presentation got me thinking about this kind of connection. So I don't know if someone can enlighten me about religion in this context, in these works, or in general in the Gothic, because we've discussed in these presentations often ideas about indigenous and ethnic others, but I guess this also relates to early immigration, European immigration in the United States, but I'm really no expert in this topic. So any comment would be just appreciated. I find it a very interesting topic. So thank you again for making that remark.
Thank you very much, Monica. Well, when it comes to Joyce Carol Oates, actually, there's not much to say about her relationship with religion, because the only thing we can say is that she uses it. I mean, she talks about it only in terms of hypocrisy, of, you know, religion used in the suburbs, used as, you know, a way to look better. I think that in this regard, I should mention probably a novel, My Sister, My Love. It's a novel inspired by the murder of John Benet Ramsey, the 6 years old beauty queen. And well, in that case, religion keeps on coming over and over and over, but only as, you know, another proof of, you know, hypocrisy, and it's not exactly something spiritual. It's something that the protagonists of that novel use just to appear pious, holy, and you know, completely you know, at ease in the suburb where they live. So yeah, I think basically that's everything that needs to be said about Oates and religion.
Well, thank you very much. Did you want to say something, Kerry? Or I saw you were nodding. Are you familiar with the work of Washington Irving?
Actually, I wanted to mention the Matthew Arnold when we're talking about them, because I know that religion in the early Gothic works was more used as a mark of difference, because there was so much anti-Catholic sentiment in England at the time. And so I think it's a little bit different, even though I think there's probably definitely similarities between the two, and the connection that Barbara brought up. But I think as far as religion, I think there's probably a lot different things going on.
Yeah, no, actually, if I may add, it's not only Spain, it's also Italy. Let's think about Walpole, Horace Walpole.
Exactly.
So it's Catholic countries in general.
Yep.
And it's just a criticism of all the, you know, wrong things that they were doing.
Yes, and used as an exoticized location, like a
yeah. Oh, you're muted, Kerry.
Yeah,
sorry, exoticized just marking somebody as different in a place that's different, so that they can, I think part of it is that they could do things in these so-called exotic locales that they maybe couldn't present as being occurring in England, at least at that time. And I know that Shakespeare did that a lot as well. So I think that's.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, precisely in the early Gothic works. Yeah, I was thinking about this because of the return to pre-enlightened times, of medieval chaotic things, and well, Catholicism has, or Catholic countries in the Anglo tradition have been associated to that quite a lot. But I was a bit intrigued about the Southern Gothic tradition, how that is transported there, because it's just kind of intriguing to me. But I guess it's just because it's a minority, but a minority inside the majority. And I think I just find it very uncanny that precisely in this work, which is set in some, I'm not familiar with it, but I guess Southern America, or at least rural America, it includes this exotic element. And I think, yeah, it's worth exploring in this context. I think I'll look into that novella. Thank you for introducing me to that, Barbara. I was not familiar with it.
You're welcome.
I'm just always fascinated to see this cross-cultural relationship. Sometimes we find it hard to find explanation. Sometimes there's no explanation. So thank you very much for introducing me to the work.
Thank you.
And well, congratulations for your presentations.
Thank you.
I'll just, before I ask Laura to ask her question, a quick follow-up, because Kerry, the episode that you skipped, the Bruce Campbell episode, whatever its title now is, I just remember it for Bruce Campbell. I mean, that has a very right. That has a very clear religious take as well. If you want to comment on that, maybe briefly to follow up on that.
Well, actually, terms of endearment, it is, I mean, it is kind of, I guess it does have religious undertones, but they're not really overtones, because in it, he is a demon, and he has come to earth in this body of Bruce Campbell, which is pretty funny. And I think he does a great job, and actually not typical Bruce Campbell job in that role. But he comes in an attempt to make a human baby. And every time he fails, he, you know, basically induces labor and murders the child. So I guess we can see that as kind of an interesting commentary on religion. But I think overall, a lot of what's in that episode works as an allegory for abortion. But unfortunately, I have so much I want to say about that episode, and I'm gonna write more about it. So hopefully you can read about it eventually.
Cool, sounds good. Laura then.
Hi. So first of all, I wanted to mention a movie that, since you're all working in themes of motherhood, I think you might be interested. It just came to mind because I watched it a couple of days ago. It's called Shirley. It's by a Swedish director, Iranian Swedish director. So if you watch it and you want to comment something on it, please do, because I thought it was a very, very interesting movie because it deals with the idea of surrogacy and this monstrous maternity through surrogation. I think it becomes much more interesting through that added layer. And also I wanted to ask Muriel specifically if you watched the movie Shirley.
I have actually, very recently.
Because I thought it was very interesting because you mentioned how Shirley Jackson had a particular relationship to her motherhood, and how I thought it was very interesting that movie didn't represent her children. It's just, I know it's not a biographical movie exactly, but I thought it was an interesting choice. And I know that some of her children have come forward saying that this is kind of a misrepresentation of her mother, but still the movie deals with maternity through also, in a similar way, not exactly surrogation in this case, but also through the woman who lives in her house and helps her. So I wanted to know if you had any comment on this regarding the representation of the author and these ideas of motherhood and how that works in the movie.
Yeah, the movie Shirley is actually really interesting because it's partially a biopic, but also not really a true representation of Shirley Jackson at all. And while it's called Shirley, and much of it revolves around sort of Shirley Jackson's down moments or her eccentric authorial personality, it's actually really more about the young woman who comes to stay in her house and how this woman comes to accept and see herself not only as a mother, but as a mother who doesn't have to be defined by the way society defines mothers and women. So the character of Shirley Jackson ends up functioning as this representation of how maternal identity can be shifted to be in its own way empowering, even when it's confined to these patriarchal assumptions. She fights with her husband, but there's a sort of mutual against the grain between them. What I found most fascinating about the movie is that it ends up being much more a statement about how motherhood as a whole can be quite frustrating. Even though Shirley Jackson's character, you never see her children, it's assumed that this is well after she's had her kids. There is this very distinct sense that she's been there, she's been through the worst of it, and she's trying to impart it. And those sort of generally hidden experiences, the experience women don't always talk about with child rearing and motherhood, she's trying to impart these to this young mother who doesn't know any of this or how she wants to develop herself. So she essentially gives this woman the opportunity to see herself as an individual woman as opposed to a woman who's just attached to her husband.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I have another general question for everyone. If I can make a second question since I'm already here. I wanted to ask maybe all of you if you've considered how class and economic status relate to these ideas of motherhood and their representations. If there's something in the works that you've analyzed that is specific to a certain class that relates in a specific way to motherhood. I was thinking, especially in Aronofsky's Mother, this is a very well-off couple. So like the fact that the house is falling apart, it's a huge house and it's a very nice house. So there's maybe, I don't know, an underlying reading there that you can make regarding this idea of the economic status of the mothers when they suffer through this complicated or monstrous pregnancies or motherhoods.
Should I start or does someone else have? All right. I would say, I find that a very fascinating subject myself, because our conceptions of womanhood and the women trapped within the domestic sphere is very much based on a more middle class and upper class female experience, because women in the lower classes or who have to work for a living, their experience was drastically different. So it is interesting to consider all of these texts in relationship to where these women stand financially and economically. I think it's interesting for at least the yellow wallpaper. This family has the resources to rent out a Gothic mansion for a couple of months, and just so the wife can relax, as the husband claims. Whereas in the Haunting of Hill House, the house is owned by a very rich family, but Eleanor Vance is the main character, and as far as we can tell, she has very little money. She got very little from her mother, who passed away. Part of that was used to buy half a car with her sister. She seems to have very little money on her own and really no substantial independence. So you do get a bit of a clash of this really rich environment of this house that has represented a very upper class experience, and this very lower class experience of Eleanor, who has nowhere to go. She's quite literally homeless once she steals the car and drives out to Hill House. Mother is a different story, just because there doesn't appear to be an economical basis in the film. Yes, it's a very big house, but it's suggested that Javier Bardem's character is this godlike figure that's essentially inherited this house. This is his house, and she's just there fixing it up. So anytime you get any sense of the economical factors, it might come in through the sort of hellish scenes where humanity invades these spaces, and you see, some of those characters end up in empowering positions where they have all the resources, and some of those people end up sort of locked in cages or struggling to survive in like the living room as opposed to the kitchen. It's a very interesting way in which the spaces get divided or used to represent different statuses and places of being, whether it's financial, economical, or simply metaphorical for other reasons.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic, especially related to the Gothic, because what you said, if we relate motherhood to this idea of the house and how the house has functioned in the Gothic as a kind of entrapment, and this idea, if you have to take, as a woman, if you have to take your role as the carer of the house, it's because you need to do that. Like, you cannot pay someone else to do that, for example, right? So thank you for your answers.
You really got me thinking Muriel, about spatial constructions in the Gothic and the horror more generally, because essentially, as you were also indicating, it's usually very much based on these binary structures at the end of the day. Inside versus outside, self versus other, and so on and so on. So I was wondering, as you were talking about the non-Euclidean features, especially in yellow wallpaper, whether you could maybe make the argument that this sort of a sort of celebration or the embrace of non-Euclidean space is maybe typical of feminist Gothic. Would you go that far?
I don't know if we can say it's typical. I do think it's a motif that appears especially in modern feminist Gothic, as conceptions of motherhood throughout the last century or so have begun shifting, and women have begun to define their own spaces. So I would say it's definitely there, and I think it's definitely something worth looking for when we go into Gothic texts, but I don't know, I can't say for certain that it would be in every text that we look at, but I think it's definitely something worth exploring to see if the defiance of these categorical dimensions allow for new innovations of space and how we understand femininity and motherhood.
Book project, if not more. Any other questions?
I was actually interested in Kelly and Barbara. Both of your presentations touched on really interesting ideas about disability and disfigurement in the Gothic. And I know this isn't entirely relevant to our panel, but it is something that we've attached to monstrous motherhood and monstrous offspring, which is tangential. As someone who teaches disability studies and disability justice, I am really interested in sort of both of your takes on how the Gothic uses disability and how perhaps we should engage with that today as opposed to over a century ago when the Gothic first came out, if you have any insights on that.
That's a tough question, actually. But probably I wouldn't, I would suggest again the novel I mentioned before for this. It's not entirely, it's not a Gothic novel, of course, but I guess that you might find something extremely interesting there.
Okay.
Yeah, because the protagonist, narrator and author of this fake memoir actually has a disability caused by gym accident when he was a child, and this thing, it returns basically every chapter. The fact that he has this, he limps because he has this problem. Can't remember if it was the leg or the foot. Can't remember, but anyway. It's this disability, and also all the because I don't know if you know more or less the story. I guess you do, because you're certainly geographically closer to the John Benet Ramsey case than I am, so probably you remember even better. And the narrator of this novel is the brother of the girl. And so what Oates considers is how life can resume after a tragedy like that. And so we are shown not only the physical disability of the boy, but also all the mental disabilities left by the tragedy. So I guess that might be quite inspiring for you.
It definitely sounds interesting, at least in this in the way that it may present an interesting comparison between the brother, who would be considered disabled,
marginal,
and his sister, though murdered, who was this ideal perfect little girl, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention about Rosie Braidotti, and I think reading a lot of the work that she's done on tetralogy is connected to that. But also, I think that historically the Gothic has used disability as a source of horror. And I think that we're trying to, I guess, leave that behind as much as possible, although it is still, I mean, we still see it, whether it's in physical disabilities, like, for example, the double in Us, that was played by Lupita Nyong'o was emulating a particular disability that makes you have issues with your voice, and I think she got a lot of negative feedback when that was revealed. So I do think people are starting to I think respond in a positive way towards that, so that we're getting away from human disfigurement and human disabilities, whether they're physical or mental. So for example, if you think about movies like Split, which are about a person with dissociative identity disorder, that is, I mean, that's not a great example, I guess, because in that film, he is both monstrous and a superhero, kind of. So like, it's this weird sort of liminal area. But I do think that there has been some kind of pushback against that as well. And I do think that that's one of the things that we need to look at in the Gothic, is that movement away towards picking out things that are just monstrous because they replicate people's disabilities or something being wrong with them, towards I guess analyzing those on what was going on, well, historically, contextually, historically, but also just getting away from just that as a mark of horror, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, disability justice is very much about shifting those kind of narratives, so that we're not looking at disability and disfigurement just as a negative, horrifying quality, but just as a part of someone's identity.
Right, absolutely.
I just find it so fascinating in relation to the Gothic, which is so focused on the embodiment of difference and how horrifying or grotesque that is, whether it's a physical embodiment or a mental illness like Psycho, for instance. This sense that because these characters are different, they must therefore be horrible. I find it's one thing that I would certainly like to explore more myself, or more broadly, is how do we move the Gothic out of that phase and that kind of narrative representation and still keep it the Gothic, keep the horror, keep that feeling of the uncanniness without continually exploiting these narratives.
That's what Right. I know, I totally agree with you. And I think that's what was I think interested me originally with this project that I did today, was because I feel like the X-Files, which of course began like 30 years ago, so we need to think about the cultural context of the time in which it began. But I think that despite all of this that they get bogged down in, and that, boy, they really do. I think they did a great job of using Scully to kind of transcend that and show that, yes, she has these creepy things about her. I mean, she's part alien now, that's not, that's weird, but she's a hero, and she's definitely shown as being, elevated, not as being, less than. And so I think that that's one thing that redeems that aspect. And there's a lot of other aspects that are problematic about the X-Files, but I think that's one thing they do really well, is using her to sort of I guess be a counterweight to all of the stuff that they do that's kind of, you know, borderline icky.
Well, I think it's very relevant that you conflated the idea of the monstrous birth, but also the divine birth. The sense that, yeah, it seems monstrous, but perhaps it's just a new paradigm that's worth exploring.
Absolutely.
Even though a lot of the X-Files is like, oh no, we don't want alien super soldiers, but there is this implication that, at least because Scully might be a really good mother, that we can create a new paradigm of what it means to be a human, to be a woman, to be a human being. Yeah.
And they definitely don't portray her giving up William as a negative thing. And so I think that's a huge thing, to not, you know, she isn't like stigmatized because of it. And so I think that's the, you know, a really positive thing as well, because I think that's often done to women who for whatever reason, not because their kid might be a alien super soldier, but for other reasons, have to, you know, end a pregnancy or give up a child. I think it's good to see another aspect to that. So.
Thank you. We have reached the time limit, basically, unless there is one final question, but it doesn't seem to be the case, I think. Thanks again for the three of you for the excellent presentations and also the Q&A afterwards.
And say that it was some very interesting presentations, and even a little bit of debate afterwards was quite nice. And well, thank you. And thanks to our public, even if they are not showing themselves.